Hello everyone, happy to see you guys. Today we're going to prepare you for the second quiz, talking about measurement and how we measure variables. And of course it's important that we define what we're looking at and find a way to give it a score, and that way we can ensure that we are able to identify cause and effect, but we need to be measuring the right thing. So measurement is a process by which we describe and ascribe meaning to the key facts, concepts, or other phenomenon that we are investigating. And you saw a video about the Flynn effect and this idea that abstraction is an important part of understanding how things are, and things that are more abstract, something like loneliness. How do you measure loneliness? You know it when you see it, you know it when you feel it, but there's no perfect way to measure it. UCLA came up with a scale of loneliness, and there are a series of questions that you could use. And so when we think about measurement and developing scales, some things are obvious, like your age or something, and some things are a little bit more abstract. Even something like gender can be a little bit more abstract, and how we measure it is open to some definition. So the word constructs is important for you to know for your quiz this week. Construct is an abstract understanding of a social issue. And when we're measuring constructs, usually there's multiple ways that we are asking questions to develop a scale. And we can understand loneliness and depression and other socially constructed ideas through a series of questions that form scores, and we can use those scores, if they are shown to be psychometrically useful, to predict outcomes. The book talks about indirect observables, things like a path. You can tell where people go by where the grass is worn away. Or just direct observations. When we're thinking about something like loneliness, there's the concept of loneliness, which is what we think about when we think of loneliness. But then the conceptualization process is important to understand that we need to come up with many different angles about it and specific questions. But conceptualization is just thinking about what aspects of loneliness are important to measure. Things like feeling isolated, things like feeling maybe depressed, things like feeling desire for other people. So you come up with different concepts and think about how those concepts can be defined. And once we define that, then we operationalize that. Operationalize is coming up with a definition and the specific question and wording of that question that can measure that. Some things are multidimensional, something like loneliness or depression. There's different ways that we could focus our thought about what those mean. And this idea of reification, assuming that an abstract concept like loneliness and depression exists in some tangible, measurable way. And it may be different for everyone in some ways, but we need some standardized way to measure it in order to ensure that we're actually measuring the right concept. And when we're measuring things, sometimes it's variable, it changes across individuals, and it's important when we're studying cause and effect that we have something that's variable, so we can understand that this happens when these variables are true. So a variable is by definition something that can vary. Things like where you're from, we're all a little bit different where we're from perhaps, age, gender, race, and anything that's changeable in a social situation can be an independent variable. A constant is anything that's the same for all of us. Usually we're human, right? Or if you're doing a survey at UTA, we're all at UTA. So a constant is something that doesn't change. These next slides are really important for your quiz and the final exam. This is big. Different ways of measuring concepts. So you can measure things by just name, so like what country your ancestors are from, what state you live in, things like that. There's just a category, and there isn't any order to it. It's just true or false about you, where you're from, what kinds of foods you like. These are nominal concepts. And when we have a survey question asking a nominal issue, it has to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. So what state are you from? We have to have all of the possible options, right? What country have you lived in the longest? We have to list all of the options, or at least be able to type in any option. It's hard to measure nominal things in a comparable way across people, but we can use it to categorize people in group, people who responded the same way, into some classification. Ordinal, we have some level of more is different than less, but it isn't consistent with ordinal, and that's what's important here. So something like, how do you rate this class on a scale 1 to 5? You know, you can pick a number that makes sense to you, but the difference between a 3 and a 4 isn't necessarily the same as 4 and a 5, right? It's arbitrary, that. And so there's some ranking, but the order isn't consistent. With interval level, now we're talking about some kind of consistent measurement. And here the slide has the example of IQ. IQ, it's a test, and each point has a certain number, each question that you answer has a certain number of points associated with it. So we can have some sort of consistency in how it's measured. And a lot of natural phenomenon, things like how much water is in a glass. It's you could consider it interval because you could double the amount or triple the amount. And so with interval, we can do fancy mathematics with it because the counting is consistent. Temperature is often something that's used at interval level. What makes temperature different from ratio? In ratio, everything is consistent, plus is a true 0. And then with temperature, 0 is sort of arbitrary, unless you're talking about degrees Kelvin. But in Fahrenheit and Celsius, 0, you can go below 0, and 0 doesn't have the meaning of nothing. So if there's something where 0 has the meaning of nothing, like how many days were you absent from school, 0 truly means nothing. Something like that, then it's ratio. So I'm going to go back a slide for a moment, and you see on the top here it says categorical. So if something is nominal or ordinal, where it's inconsistent how it's measured, we're just categorizing people into whether or not a certain characteristic is true for you or not. And a lot of socially constructed ideas, like your race, ethnicity, it's categorical. Your mood today, it's usually categorical. But we're trying to develop things that are continuous. You see continuous on the top of the slide. Continuous we can do more fancy math with. And so the reason when we're measuring loneliness, we develop a scale that ranges from 0 to 5 or something, a higher number like that. By enabling us to have some sort of consistency in the measure, we can then do fancy mathematics to it, and we could talk about a score of 10 being twice as high as a score of 5. You can only do that for interval or ratio level variable. And so if it's at all possible to measure a concept with interval or ratio level measurement, we will do so because it enables us to do fancy statistics. Here we have this word operational definition. That's the exact question you're going to ask, and you need specific traits of that issue that you're studying, the indicators. And so if you Google the Mental Measurements Yearbook, you'll see how different mental health issues are measured with different kind of scales and the very specific conceptual ideas that are within each of our kind of broader classifications of conditions. Concepts at the top here is more broad. When we're thinking about a concept, it's defined in terms of other concepts. So we're thinking about isolation and what are things like isolation that are similar. So that's more conceptual. Operational is the exact question that you're going to ask, and how you're going to word it, and then how you're going to measure it. So you may ask people, have you felt upset 2 or 3 days more this week? Have you felt upset this week? And then the options are no, 1 to 2 days this week, 3 to 5 days this week. You come up with different categories. That's operationalizing it. And operationalizing both the question and the responses is a whole topic for another time. There's ways that you can test different wordings of the definition and such. So operationalization is the process by which researchers conducting quantitative research spell out precisely how a concept will be measured and how to interpret that measure. And so this has to include what it is that we're measuring, what the measure is that's being used, and how it will be interpreted. And usually we set up like mild and moderate and severe kind of classifications for conditions. That's part of the operationalizing process. Some things are easy, like attendance in class or age, directly observable, but most things that we're doing in the social sciences are more complicated and they're multidimensional, and we need multiple questions to measure it, like a checklist of many different related issues, a scale. Here it says about Likert scales. Likert scales are from that scale of 1 to 5 usually, although it could be 1 to 7, where you say something is extremely unlikely, somewhat unlikely, or different variations of that. So we're trying to get a consistent measurement, which is reliable, as well as an accurate measurement, which is valid. And so if you ask the wrong questions, if you ask the wrong details, you might get something that's neither reliable nor valid, and at different times people will give you totally different responses. Or you might get something that's always giving you a consistent value, but it's not accurate to that person's condition that you're trying to measure. Or it could be accurate to that person's condition, but not consistent. So we test out these kinds of measures again and again through these different ways, through either retest reliability, where a measure is given multiple times and is consistent each time under different circumstances to see, and to different people to see how much similarity there is. Sometimes if it's something asked in person, we'll have inter-rater reliability. This is the degree to which different observers agree to what happened. And we'll look for internal consistency with other related measures. So we may ask the same concept multiple times in multiple ways and see whether it's consistent across different versions. We can look at face validity, which is just, does this seem right? If it doesn't seem right, then it fails the face validity test. We look at content validity, in which case we're studying, is we actually measuring the topic that we measure. So if we ask questions that are unrelated to the topic, so say we're asking about your diet in a question about depression, there may be some relevance, but it might not be totally related to the central construct, so it might not be content valid. We're looking at criterion validity, and criterion validity, what we're measuring should predict the outcome. So things that predict depression should predict the outcomes of depression. And concurrency. With concurrent, we're looking at is what we're studying related to that issue at the same time. We can also look at convergent validity, in which case related topics are in fact related, as well as discriminant validity, in which case different topics should not be related because they're different. Sometimes error is systematic, in which the case is consistent and there's a bias. And sometimes it's just random error, and we don't need to worry about random error in some cases, but sometimes we do. Sometimes it's a false negative, sometimes it's a false positive. The video link here is a Simpsons cartoon where everyone agrees because they want to be part of the group, and that's this idea of acquiescence bias. And a lot of psychological studies, if you're part of a group, there's some pressure to conform. And so being aware of these potential systematic errors is important in understanding whether or not we're measuring the right topic. Or random errors sometimes cancel itself out at the big picture level, but at the individual level, that random error can be important in identifying, because it could falsely identify people. as having a condition that are falsely identified or missing people who should have been identified. There's your book, it talks about the election and whether or not the instructions were on the top or on the side, and people didn't read the instructions on the side, so the results were very different whether or not the instructions were on the top or the side. And so when we're developing ways to measure things, there can be some systematic error based on how the question was asked, even as simple as what side of the paper the instructions were on. In the case of elections, it's on purpose because they're trying to bias the results in some way. But in the case of research, we want to avoid that. So when we're doing qualitative work, we usually find a working definition of what it is we're studying, and we try to create a measure through consistent interviewing of people and analyzing what they tell us and trying to see whether or not what people are telling us matches our definition of the issue. And we use a mix of inductive and deductive reasoning. All right, I want to make sure you're prepared for your quiz this week. So remember that when we talk about the different orders of measurement, the nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, that nominal things, when we're measuring nominal, it needs to be exclusive and exhaustive, right? You need to have everything possible there. Remember that that's what's important. And remember that things that are constant are constants, and things that vary are variables. Also, when we talked about reliability and validity, you'll remember that reliability and validity are interrelated, though they're separate things. But it's important to remember that reliability is a prerequisite for validity. Okay, so in order for something to be valid, it actually needs to be reliable too. If it's not reliable, then it can't be valid. So reliability is in fact a prerequisite for validity. And remember the definitions about conceptualization, what conceptualization refers to, the process of creating a clear, concise definition of a topic, and remember that if you're only measuring what something is and not worried about the quantity of it, then we're talking about a nominal order. Nominal is about categorizations and not about quantity. Almost everything else can be quantity, but nominal is not about quantity. It's just what category, what person fits themselves into. There's one way that we can test how things work and whether or not it's as you expect. We can look at this test, retest reliability, where we look for consistency. That's one of the most common ways that we can measure whether or not we're measuring the right issue and whether it works in different populations. We're thinking about interval level of measurement. Interval level measurement, remember there's consistency in that, but there isn't necessarily a true zero. Okay, so when you're looking at the question about interval level, remember there's no true zero, but there's consistency in measurements. If you know that, you'll do well on that question. When we think about, I'm sure you'll know any question related to nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio, because we've made that clear, I hope. And the book talks a lot more extensively about the statistics we use to test for inter-item reliability. And there's a specific test for that called Cronbach's alpha. So Cronbach's alpha is the way we mathematically test for test, retest reliability. And finally, when we're thinking about whether a measure, an instrument actually measures what it's designed to test, that is validity, okay? We're testing for validity when we're seeing whether or not we're actually measuring what we need to measure. So with that, I think you should be good for quiz 2, and you can focus your attention on other aspects of the class. Thank you so much.